Hello everyone, welcome to our tutorial on the best practices for batch importing or bulk uploading CSV files into AtoM, which is access to memory and archival collections management system. And in this particular video, we'll be looking at how to include CSV files that have all levels of archival description. So going from the parent level, such as phone collections or records groups, as well as including child levels such as series, files, or items. Now we are going to get started with preparing our file for the bulk upload. And with this, the first step is to download your CSV import template. These have been prepared by Artifactual, and you can find them to download on the AtoM's wiki page. There's a link here on the screen. I just have also a screenshot of that particular page so you can see what it looks like. We need to be able to start with a template that has all of the proper columns and fields set out so that way when we import the data, the software will know where to put all of the data. You'll have to download the import template according to the version of AtoM you're running, as well as based on the type of import that you want to prepare. In this case, there are many different options of types of bulk imports that you can do. There's archival descriptions, authority records, accessions, physical storage, among others. In this particular video that we're doing, we're looking at archival description. So that's a template that we're going to download. There are also a couple different versions of the archival description templates. So there is one for RAD, you'll see, as well as one for which is the RAD being the rules for archival description. That's the archival standard for Canada. And then also you'll have a template that maps to ISAT fields, which is the international standard of archival description. So depending on what environment you're working in, you want to download the one that's more appropriate to how you approach archival description and the standards that you use. Just as a note for DAX users, there's no DAX template, but many of the ISAT fields map well to DAX fields. There's also a documentation page through AtoM that you can look at for more information on how to map DAX fields to the ISAT fields. The other part of picking our template that we need is selecting the proper template for the version of AtoM that your instance is running. It's pretty easy to check if you don't know which one it is, and so that's just by when you've logged into your user interface on your database page, you'll go to admin and then go to settings, and then just at the top, you'll see your application version. So that's going to tell you what version of AtoM your instance is running. You just need to make sure that you pick the download template that corresponds to the version that you have, because over time, different versions of AtoM have different options and function a little bit differently, and the templates correspond to those changes. So that's why it's important to pick the right one. So for this particular tutorial, I'm going to be looking at the ISAT archival description CSV. You can see a screenshot of a portion of it anyway here at the bottom of the slide. There's a whole bunch of different columns. They have titles at the top that correspond to various data that either the database needs in order to be able to upload something properly with, and also to be able to represent the hierarchies, or just columns that correspond to archival descriptive standards and, you know, the different information that we want to include in archival description as archivists, such as dates and like physical description of our records. So once you've downloaded your template off of the wiki site, then we have to open it in some sort of spreadsheet processor. So this could be Microsoft Excel, LibreOffice Calc, or Google Sheets. For me personally, I prefer to use LibreOffice because it tends to handle special characters and accents better than Excel does. I have a colleague, however, who always uses Google Sheets. I've never used that personally, so I can't really speak to it. Just to say, especially if you're using accents and special characters, you might want to look at something other than Microsoft Excel, but there are lots of people who use that as well. So just have to figure out what may work best for you. So, and then once we open up our template, this is what it looks like. As you see, I've opened it in Excel. It was the easiest one available to me at the moment. But there are other options to be able to use your CSV template and to edit it. Now that we have our template downloaded, the next step is starting to fill in our CSV import sheet. And so AtoM is developed and has been developed to mirror archival practice. And part of this is adhering and making space for different archival standards, but also it's mirrors you're able to mirror hierarchies that we use in archival practice. So that would be for the parent levels, which are records groups, collections, foam, most typically. That would be the highest level, the top level, or then we have child levels. So these could be series, files, or items. The first few columns in our spreadsheet tell the software what the hierarchies are. So our first few columns are legacy ID, I'm just going to use my pointer here, legacy ID, parent ID, and then we have a third one, qubit parent slug. To begin with, the legacy ID column. The simplest option to approach this column is numerically, so just number each row in numerical order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as you see here on the screen, and continue on like that. The most important part about legacy ID column is that every single row has to have a unique number. They can't repeat, so you can't have two number 26s, for example, and each row has to have a number. And this helps the software interpret the rows, give it a number, especially when we move on to using the parent ID column. But no matter what, the legacy ID column has to be filled out, and it has to have a unique number in each one. There is one exception to this rule, and that's when we're importing translations. The nice thing with archival description templates is that you can, if you wish, import archival descriptions in your primary language of description. So let's say, for example, that's in English, and maybe you have a second language on your database as well, perhaps Spanish, and you could import both the English and Spanish versions of each of your descriptions together via the import function. And in that case, you would have two row number 1, for example, but that's the only exception. Otherwise, each row has its own unique number. Next in the parent ID column, that is where we can identify hierarchies within our data. So we can tell the software who the parent is of a child level description. So for example, if we're looking at this one here, right here, our top level, our parent, is P127, and that's the Lennoxville Curling Club foam. And then so that's row 1. And then in our next row, we have administration. That's series. So that's a child of the curling club. And we have to tell the software who the parent is in the parent ID column. You'll notice for our top level, there's no number in the parent ID column because it's the top. It has no parent. But the administration has a parent, and its parent is row. So the administration is row 2, but its parent is row 1, which is indicated here. And so that's how we tell the database, and when it's importing our spreadsheet, who the parent and the children are and how they're connected. And so you're always indicating the most immediate parent. So if I'm going down and I'm looking at, we have a file here, it's history, and the parent to that particular file isn't the curling club. The immediate parent is the subseries, which in this case is Constitution and Rules. So for history, the parent is found in row 3. So that's how we have it indicated. Another thing to note as you are preparing your spreadsheet is that child level descriptions have to appear after the parent in the spreadsheet. This is important because when the database imports your bulk import document, it's going to go line by line. So if a parent appears after the child, it's not going to know that it exists yet because it hasn't gotten to a lower row. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. And that's how we identify parents who are on our spreadsheet. But what happens if we are we have already some top level descriptions in our database and we want to identify children or do some further descriptive work and prepare child level descriptions for that phone that's already been uploaded to the database. So because that description doesn't appear in our spreadsheet, it already exists on the AtoM database, we have to identify who its parent is. And there's actually a way to be able to do that. And that's what we're going to get to on the next slide. That's what that one's called. So if you wish to add descriptions to a top level or any higher level of description that's already on AtoM, you just need to use the slug portion of the URL and put that into the qubit parent slug column. So the slug part is anything that appears after the / in the URL for this particular description. So right now in my little example, if I wanted to add children to my Constitution and Rules subseries, then I would use the slug that I've identified. I'd put that in the qubit parent slug column without the / and then it would be able to add children in to what I already have in the database. So that's pretty cool. So you can, right now, if you're just concentrating on top levels, you could do a bunch of top level descriptions to get those up. And then you can go back and add things by bulk upload if you want to do lower levels as you start to be able to work on more detail into your collection description. Just one thing to note, if you happen to put parent data in both the parent ID and the qubit parent slug columns, the software would default to using the data in the qubit parent slug column, and it's going to ignore the parent ID column. So really only one column should be filled out. That's all you'll need. You're either pointing to a parent that's in your spreadsheet, and so then you would use your parent ID column, or you're going to point it to a description that's already in your database, and so then you would need the slug. General best practices for CSV imports. First of all, it's not necessary to fill out all the columns. There are lots of columns, especially in RAD. ISAD is a little bit more restrained, but there are tons and tons of columns, and it can be really overwhelming to think that you need to fill them all out. You don't. Great. You can pick and choose the ones that you want to fill out for the most part. However, there are fields that must be filled out, and they are the legacy ID, parent ID, or qubit parent slug if you're identifying a parent description, the identifier, title, level of description, and culture. These ones are really critical if you're doing your archival description, a bulk upload, and everything else is just sort of more icing on the cake. But if you don't include the ones that must be filled out, there's either your import will fail or it could potentially fail and not function properly. Also, if you're working in a multi-repository instance of AtoM, the repository column should also be filled in. If you forget to fill this in and you're working in a multi-repository instance, especially if you don't have access to the descriptions of other repositories, you risk importing a bunch of descriptions, particularly if they're in draft, and then you don't have access to them because the database doesn't realize that you have permission for them. So it's really important. They just kind of end up floating. So it's really important that you identify the repository as well. if you're working in a multi-repository instance. Just in general, good archival practice, some other fields that you should probably fill in if you can are extent and medium, scope and content, language, script, publication status, event dates, event types, and then your event start and end dates. So those would be recommended. And but at the end of the day, each institution can establish its own preferences for minimum archival description. So those aren't absolutely necessary, but they're just recommended. Archival descriptive standards, like the standards related columns. Many of the columns in the CSV templates map to fields in descriptive standards, so either the rules for archival description or the international standard of archival description. And so those are what a lot of the fields are. Some of the fields are purely functional for the database or for the software to be able to import your bulk upload properly. But then the rest of these are sort of archival descriptive standards related. To help guide you, the import templates include a reference to the corresponding rule in the relevant descriptive standard. So I've got a little screenshot here. This is the template from the ISAD archival description template, and it's for each category that is for each column or field that is connected to some rule in the ISAD descriptive standard, it gives you the rule that it corresponds to. So for instance, if you're not quite sure what should go in archival history, you can go to ISAD article 3.2.3 and then look at what their guidelines are, and then make it or either fill it out properly or make a decision that maybe that's not a field that you need to fill out. Also to note is you can delete any unused columns from your CSV spreadsheet and it won't affect your bulk upload functionality. So perhaps you've decided that, for instance, appraisal, that's not a field that you're ever going to use. You can just delete that right out of your spreadsheet and it makes it a little bit less intimidating to work with because you'll have fewer columns in your view. Of course, the exceptions to these are don't ever delete the fields that you absolutely need in order to make sure your bulk import works properly, which we discussed in the last slide. But some of those extras that are out there, you can go ahead and get rid of them. And so just for more information on the standards columns and how they've mapped all of those in AtoM, you can visit the AtoM documentation page. Some best practices for some of the trickier columns. So we're talking about, the standards columns, they're pretty straightforward. You fill them out, you don't fill them out in whatever format, you want. But then there are some where they can be a bit trickier and pose some problems. In particular, these are any columns that have a controlled vocabulary. So if you're thinking about imagine, when you're using AtoM in the browser user interface and you click to enter a certain field, such as we're going to do level of description. And if in the user interface you get a drop-down list that appears of your different options that you can pick from, it means that you're going to need it's a controlled vocabulary item. And if the corresponding column also so in the corresponding column, you also have to make sure that you're using the controlled vocabulary terms. If you don't use a term from the available list, it will create a new term and can then cause duplicates that will make the database function less efficiently when searching. One example that's just pretty straightforward would be if I if I'm putting in my subject access points and I wanted to put in cars, and that's my controlled vocabulary term in our access points in our particular database, and I happen to type in just car in the singular, it's going to create a duplicate subject access point, sort of duplicate. It's going to create one for car because it couldn't find one. It doesn't know that I actually meant cars. So it's not that smart that way. It does what we tell it to, but we have to give it the right instructions. So you just have to be careful that anything any columns that are using some controlled vocabulary terms and all of the possible ones are here displayed on the screens. Just make sure that you're using the terms that are already available. And another thing to note, you can add two different data values in a single cell, and they're separated by a vertical line, also known as a pipe. If you're putting in two or more, it could be 4 or 5, 10 subject terms, for example, you can put them all in. They just need to be separated all by a pipe, and there shouldn't be any spaces in between any of these. And then just at the bottom of the screen, if you don't know how to get your vertical line or the pipe, there's the shortcut of how to do that. So here's some other tips for specific columns. Language, in this particular one, we're talking about language, culture, and physical objects. So the language columns, they're using language codes and script codes. Here on the screen, you have access to the links to be able to find your language codes that are used in language of description and culture. And then you can access your script codes at the Unicode link. Just for example, if for French and English, our descriptions would be EN or FR for either of those, and the script for both of those languages is Latin, so it would be LATN is what we'd be filling out for those. But if you need to find out what others are, you have the links there. In the culture column, this is a column that must be filled in, and the culture is the language in which you're doing your description. So if you're doing your archival description in English, your culture column should say English. And if you're doing your language of description in Spanish, then your culture column would say Spanish. If you're, and particularly important if you have like a multilingual database, because you want to make sure that you're telling the database or the software the proper language that you're importing into, because then it will think you might have put in an English description and then identified it as Spanish. So then Spanish users, if they're on the Spanish side of the interface, they're going to be getting English descriptions. So the culture column must be filled in. If it's blank, your upload will fail, and really just make sure that you're putting in the values for the language that you're using for your description. Physical object columns, it's not necessary to use these if you're not using the physical storage area of AtoM, so you can just ignore them. If you do want to use these fields in your bulk upload, it's kind of a more detailed process, so I would suggest following the link to AtoM's documentation for more tips on how to fill those 3 columns out. So identifier and your repository column. One thing I'll say about the identifier, so this is your call number, part of your reference code for your particular file or item or series. It's when filling in this is particularly important when you're filling in child level descriptions. It's only necessary to put the part of the identifier that is specific to the level that you are describing in the identifier section. So if you just look at the screenshots that I've taken here, if we want the arrow is pointing towards correspondence, and you see I just have a 002 for correspondence because that's the part of the identifier or the code that refers just to that file level right there. But it's a file that's in a subseries, that's in a series, that's in a phone, and those are identified all by the stars that I've put. And as you see, it's inheriting like one, and then I've gone and taken a screenshot of what it looks like on the database once it's been uploaded. And you'll see I'm looking at correspondence and it's showing me the whole full reference code, even though in my spreadsheet I've only put in the 002. You see how it inherits the identifiers from the parent levels in order to form a complete code. So I don't need to put in the whole thing for the correspondence because it's just going to take, what it will do instead is it will take the higher levels. So that's important, particularly if you're doing child level description. And then in the repository column, this is just a note. So this needs to be filled out at your top level description, but it's not necessary to identify your repository, the maintaining repository, and all of the child level descriptions, because this is another piece of information that's inherited from the parent. As you can see here, again, I'm looking at a child of, the correspondence is a child of the of the Langsville Curling Club, or no, sorry, it's part of the Langsville Curling Club, which is part of the Eastern Townships Resource Center's collection. And we can see clearly that the repository has been identified. It took this information from its parent levels, so you don't need to fill that out. Double checking. So once you have all of that filled out and you you have all of that filled out, you've filled in the columns that you need to fill in, you filled in the other columns that you'd like to fill in, then you can double check your data before importing. To help avoid failed imports, it's important to, first of all, it's ideal if you can limit the rows in each of your CSV uploads. If you're uploading through the browser user interface, there's no hard limit on the number of rows that will import, but I have found like upwards of 200 in and around there. It is less of a guarantee that they'll all go through. I mean, sometimes you can do more, but there's no guarantee and there's no hard limit. So sometimes it's just better to be on the cautious side if you're uploading CSVs that have a lot of rows. Also check for spaces in controlled columns with controlled vocabulary, such as language or access points. For instance, if there's languages and I have the EN, but I've accidentally put a space at the end, it's not going to read that information properly. So just make sure that you don't have extra spaces kicking around in those columns, and that there's no sort of space or just a couple like pieces of data or cells that are filled out in rows that you didn't actually end up using, because then it can create kind of blank records potentially on your upload. Also, just as a note and something to keep in mind, after your bulk upload, it's good practice to keep your upload files so that if you need to go back and update information in bulk, you can simply edit your upload file and then re-import it as an update. Importing your bulk upload into AtoM. So now AtoM offers a CSV validator function. This will check your CSV upload file for critical errors that would cause your upload to fail or cause major errors in your database functioning once it's uploaded this kind of only partially processed data. And that can create a big mess. So the validate CSV function is just in the import options. And I've actually went ahead and imported I validated rather, using the CSV validator, a CSV file that I knew should fail. And so I had taken out some information legacy ID and the culture check, and here it is telling me, giving me warnings that I have some errors in those in those columns. That way I can go back and fix those before importing. Finally, importing your bulk upload into AtoM. Once you're ready to do that, you go to import, select CSV, then select the type of import you're doing. So in this case, we're doing archival descriptions. That corresponds to the template that you downloaded. And then we're going to select the behavior we want. So for new uploads, we choose ignore matches and create new records on import. For CSVs that are updated versions of uploads you've already done, you can either choose update matches or delete matches. And then you can further narrow this by limiting to a specific collection, which can be really helpful. And then finally, you select your file, your CSV file, and then import it. And wait a little bit, and hopefully everything will has gone smoothly, and you'll be able to see your uploads in just a couple minutes live there in your database, which is really satisfying.